Was there anything that was said by Brent Venables that would give any indication as to how pleased he was? I'm guessing, as I've heard regularly out of all these coaches, they try to de-emphasize the spring game because they know this is the one that everybody gets to see, and so they blow it out of proportion, as opposed to this is 1 out of 15 evaluations that the coaches have of these players each spring. But whether it's just focused on what he had to say following the game that was directed strictly at this game, or now that he's been able to assess all of spring practice, uh, anything that stands out in terms of what he's looking at?
Yeah, I mean, he talked. He was pleased, definitely pleased after the game was over, and some of the comments that he made. I mean, he didn't go in detail about what specifically he was pleased about, but talked a lot about what he felt was one of the biggest concerns coming in is really kind of the change of culture, right? Changing the culture, practicing the right way, showing up the right way. Um, being physical, like a lot of those intangible things that he has preached upon early on in the spring camp. So I think he was very well pleased with from that perspective. I think the one thing that he was really just kind of gushed about was the leadership that has began to manifest and kind of bring to the forefront. And an example that he mentioned is with this being the spring game and didn't start till 3 p.m. local time, that he let the kids sleep in a little bit, right? They didn't have to come in as early as they typically would for a game day, or typically where they would for a spring or a fall camp practice. And there was a player-led, player-only walkthrough that happened. So I think that was something, coming from a coaching perspective, is very pleasing. Obviously, understanding that you've got that buy-in to it to a degree that that they're really they're really bought in. I think he's mentioned that time and time again, and talked a lot about that, as well as how bought in he is with the or how bought in the players are with what they're trying to do and what they're trying to create, and where they're at. And I think that's the biggest, maybe one of the biggest concerns early on. Not as much about X's and O's, because he's said several times, we're going to be in a different hemisphere, X's and O's related, where we're at right now versus where we'll be at the end of fall camp. But I think what he's doing, what he's most proud of right now, is the foundation that he's been able to lay with these players, and setting that stage for what they need to do during the summer, to be able to put themselves in position, athletically and from a body type. And I think that's the next thing to kind of think about, right? I mean, it's a little bit of a give and take in terms of the strength and conditioning side of things. So you've got to have, offensively, you've got to have yourself in a position where you're able to play at the pace that Levy wants to play at, from an offensive perspective, but also getting bigger and getting stronger, and being able to be more physical at the point of attack is going to be interesting. And I think this comment that you have on the screen here is very evident, because a lot of times on the broadcast, I went back and I watched, and I've seen this question posed just generally for ex players that have been around, like, how is this Brent Venables different than he was before? Before he was the defensive coordinator here at Oklahoma. And I think there's a lot of discussion where, yes, he's the same person, the same passion that he brings to the table is what he always has had, but maybe even a little bit more, which is a little bit crazy, given the fact that this is 10, 12 years ago. You would think that maybe you lose some of the passion, but obviously, being the head coach at a big program like Oklahoma, you have to have that. You have to have that passion, right? So I think once I think there's a little bit of Dabo in what he's doing. There's a lot of traditions that he's bringing forward from Clemson that is going to be part of the Oklahoma culture. I think that all in mentality, I think, is what he's brought in. He's got a lot of Bill Snyder in him in terms of kind of preparation and things like that. And then, obviously there's some Stoops, Bob Stoops, part of that as well. So I think, hopefully from an Oklahoma perspective, when you look at it, maybe it's the best of those of the three worlds, so to speak, and what he brings to the table. But I think the intangibles are was a big part of what he was pleased with. There was some bust in the secondary, and there was some communication things that happened that you would typically expect to happen in the spring game. Maybe even things that you would expect to happen in fall camp. But I think the coaching that Oklahoma has on the defensive side of the ball specifically will help and get them in a good position. Maybe not game one, by middle of the season. I think you'll look at a defense that's probably one of the top 20, 30 defenses in the country.
So when you mentioned that it is a bit surprising that somebody maintains or even increases their energy level and their drive, their emotion for a position 10 and 12 years later, I think we also need to keep in mind something that you've addressed in the past, that Brent Venables wasn't just a coordinator and who all of a sudden, because he had done so well, was offered a head coaching position and then had to kind of scramble to figure out what he wanted to do. He's a good mix, it appears, of somebody who's very communication based, relationship based, but also calculating and organized and thoughtful toward the future. And so he knew exactly the way he wanted to run a football program. And so he's been waiting for this opportunity and waiting for the right opportunity, and had it mapped out how he would do things if he was in charge. And so now he's getting that opportunity at maybe the place he wanted to be. And it's his program and he's running with it.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that you notice early on here, and obviously still ongoing, is that he was very, very prepared for this opportunity, right? And when I say that, like, he knows, he has, kind of a list of things that he knows that, number one, he wants to implement. But I think at a higher level, he knew what his plan was for for taking on this program, whether it was Oklahoma, whether it was, would have been Auburn, or wherever it would have been, prepared for this moment. A long time assistant, and finally getting his opportunity. So yeah, I think it's something that you can see how prepared he was, and certainly there'll be some things that come around where he's maybe not as prepared for, doesn't have the experience from a head coaching perspective. But I think that, it, as of right now, it seems like, and there was a list of things that he said, these are things that we have to have in place before I'm, willing to take this job to be able to compete at an SEC level. So I think understanding those things, and what it takes to be successful in different areas within, kind of conference wise, and when the difference between, he talked a lot about the difference between being good and being great. And I think if you go from, it's a lot more difficult from going from being good to being great, from being average to being good, right? So I think taking that next step, laser focused on what needs to happen to be able to take that next step to be a national championship contending team. And I don't think anyone thinks that's going to happen this year, right? I mean, I think, but within a couple of years, I think you can see that this program has the opportunity to, compete for that national championship.
Yeah, the average to good versus the good to great is something that could be measured in a number of ways throughout the football program. But the easiest way to measure it is, obviously, it's going to come down to the wins and the losses. And yes, we see a lot of capable coaches take over. Now, this was not the case here, but take over bad programs that are winning 2 and 3 games, and they elevate them to bowl status, 6 or 7 wins. And that's commendable. It's a significant upgrade, but they're basically beating the teams that they should beat and maybe winning most of the games against the teams on their tier. And those coaches have gone and they've upgraded it significantly. But to go then from 7 wins to 10, then that's an enormous leap, because then you're talking about knocking off teams that are at the top of your league on a fairly consistent basis. So that takes some. Now, again, the Oklahoma situation is much different, but sure, yes. I don't think anyone would bat an eye if Brent Venables stepped in and Oklahoma won 9 games all the time. And that wouldn't necessarily satisfy Oklahoma fans, but uh, yeah, to reach the level that is his goal and the standard of the program, it's going to take excellence, of course, in all these facets to get it done.